Yeah, well, I found it. I found out of the deck. But okay, just kidding. Hi, Next Nation. Thanks for having me. So this is the name of my talk. And as you probably guessed it, we're going to be talking about making mobile apps with Nuxt today. So first of all, let's have a look at some applications. So this is an app we all have. This is my phone camera app. For Android users, you probably have a similar one. For iPhone users, you have the iPhone one. This is what we call a native app. What we mean by that it's developed using the phone-specific programming language. For Android, it's Java or Kotlin. For iOS, it's Swift or Objective-C. But you know that as developers, we don't like to code things twice. So what do we do in that case? Do we only code an iOS app and call it a day? Well, that doesn't really make sense from a marketing point of view, given that the market share for Android and iOS is more or less the same. So we'll need two apps. To answer that issue, we have Flutter, for example. It's a Dart-based framework developed by Google, and with it, we can develop apps for Android and iOS in one go. Google is using it for many of its applications, and here's the Philips Hue application that's also coded in Flutter. So, okay, Flutter and Dart, that's an option, but in this room, we're mostly JavaScript developers, aren't we? So in that case, you probably heard about React Native. React Native, like Flutter, also allows you to create apps for Android and iOS in one go. And here's a camera app made with React Native. But, well, I hear you. Now you might be thinking, cool, Lucie, that's quite some technologies you got there, but I came today to hear about Nuxt. And sure enough, so here's a third camera application. I made this one, and I made it with Nuxt. And it comes with an experimental UI, I know, and I know you're not here to talk about photography, but really the gist of this app is to take the focus on taking panoramic shots, hence the wide viewfinder. It also comes with control over the phone camera sensor, like a real camera, all of that with smooth animations and everything. And what's interesting here is that bringing us back to mobile apps, is that none of those camera things are really associated with Nuxt or web development as a whole. Indeed, while we know we can make any kind of website with Vue and Nuxt, we also saw that we just can make also really capable mobile apps with them. So let's learn more about that today. But before, I'm Lucie Haberer, and I'm working in France for Prismic, a headless CMS, as a developer experience engineer. And as you can tell, I've been a lot into cameras lately. Any kind of camera, really, like digital cameras, film cameras, and even weird ones, like this 20 or so years old Nokia phone that is quite an attention grabber at parties. But I also have a lot of fun shooting things with it. Like I used it to document the small core team retreat we had with Nuxt earlier this year in Bordeaux. And actually, I have it right here. So let's take a quick selfie with it together. I'll share it later on Twitter. So it's a bit weird because I don't have a front-facing screen, but in some practice, you can take pretty fine screen selfie with it. But okay, enough with the Nokia phone. Let's get back to my camera app and to some necessary background story. So I made this app to experiment the UI of a real camera prototype that is developed not by a big company, but by a small group of enthusiasts based in Japan. The project is called Keirin, and earlier this year, they held an event in Tokyo to showcase their work and their prototype. I really wanted to attend this event, but sadly, for various reasons, I couldn't. This meant I couldn't experience the prototype in my own hand, and this left me quite frustrated. And that's where I thought, what if instead I developed its UI for mobile apps? And that's how it started. That's how I embarked on a journey to build a mobile app. So nowadays, I'm not a mobile app developer. I've had some experience building some back to my freelance day. And one thing I knew from the get-go is that I didn't want to go native. I know it's quite some work and not an ecosystem I'm really familiar with these days. I wanted something JavaScript-based. In the JavaScript world, we have React Native, but I'm not a traitor. I won't write a single line of code of that unholy framework. if I were to write a mobile app with JavaScript, it would be with Vue and Nuxt, as everything should be. So, okay, then how do you build a mobile app with Nuxt? Well, before I give you some answer to that question, I want to make this talk a bit interactive. So I have these kinds of slides that will pop up now and then, and they allow me to prompt you all about something. And the first thing I want to prompt you about is, have you ever built a mobile app with Nuxt? So if you do, like, please take your phone and scan one of those QR code. Alternatively, if you have an old Nokia phone like I do, you can just follow one of those links above. Let me do it myself. Well, here we go. And just to accommodate the stream delay, I'll be back to this slide in a few. So, okay, how do you build a mobile app with Nuxt? The idea when building a mobile app with Nuxt is that you want to end up with a mobile app, but you want the developer experience of it to feel as much like developing a Nuxt website. And to do so in the JavaScript world, we're blessed with Capacitor. And before we talk more about Capacitor, let's get back to my slides, and we can see you're answering right now, so I'm a bit in the future compared to you. But, well, we can see actually, like, I'm pleasantly surprised. There's a lot of people that did build mobile app with Nuxt before. So that's cool. You maybe already know about Capacitor, but in that case, please stay along. I'm sure there will be things for you to pick up. And for the majority of us that didn't build an app with Nuxt before, well, you'll learn a lot of things. Cool. So then what is Capacitor? Capacitor, it's a native runtime for building web native apps for Android, iOS, and more. But today, we'll only focus on Android and iOS. Also, some of you might know about Apache Cordova. It's, in a way, we can consider Capacitor as the modern successor of Cordova. But then how does Capacitor work? Well, it works by rendering our UI inside a web view. And then it connects this UI to the native components of our phones through a bridge. And this is the main difference between Capacitor apps and other kind of apps. In a native apps, everything is rendered in native code. The UI is in it, the component logic is in it, and everything else native code. In a React Native app, the UI is compiled from React in a native code, but all the logic from React is still run in a JavaScript engine on this side. So React Native apps also have a similar bridge to Capacitor to connect the JavaScript engine and the logic to the native code. But getting back to Capacitor, let's be clear about it, like using a web view to render the UI, this has an impact on performances. But in my opinion, phones have gotten so much faster these days that this is way more than tolerable. I don't know about you, but I rarely complain about Chrome being slow on my phone. And on the brighter side, because our UI is installed inside a web view, this means we can benefit from everything we already know about web development to build our app. We can share code between our apps, like the mobile app and the web app. They can all have the same code and the code base and stuff like that. We can also share the same developer experience because we'll be able to develop our app in a browser with HMR or even on our phone directly and still with HMR. So, okay, that's the plan. We're going to build the next app and use Capacitor to turn it into a mobile app. We can get started with just a few commands. Basically, here we're initializing Capacitor itself, and then we are adding iOS and Android as export targets like this. From here, we can just craft our app with divs and spans as we'll have to. We can put a nice coat of CSS on it. And wait, how did I make anything with the camera of my phone if it's just a web app? Well, remember, earlier on, we said that Capacitor has a bridge between the web view and the native code of our phone. And we can leverage that bridge to ask for permissions, to fire up Toast, or to operate the camera. And how do we leverage that bridge? Well, we leverage that bridge through Capacitor plugins. So we have a lot of Nuxt developers in this room, don't we? Well, in Nuxt, we have something called Nuxt modules. We have the Tailwind CSS module, the Nuxt image module, a random one, the Prismic module, and many others. With Nuxt modules, you can extend your Nuxt app and add endless functionalities to it. On the Capacitor side, we have Capacitor plugins. With Capacitor plugins, similarly to Nuxt module, we can extend our Capacitor app to add endless native functionalities to it. And like Nuxt modules, there's a lot of Capacitor plugins out there. Let's go through two examples. We have the Capacitor dialog plugin, which allows you to prompt users for confirmation through native dialog. And a more abstract one, we have the Capacitor file system plugin. That allows your app to basically read and save files to the file system of the mobile phone. But that's just two of them. And you have a complete list of all the available plugins on Capacitor's documentation. And there's also a lot of community modules available out there on their organization. When building my mobile app, my camera app, I used many plugins. And of course, one of them had to be a camera plugin. So Capacitor does offer a camera plugin. When I first saw it, I was like, great. I'll use it, build my app, and call it a day. And that's what I did. I tried it. I started building things with it, but I quickly realized that I could only take basic pictures with it. Namely, it offered little to no control over the camera sensor, and I wanted control for the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture. And well, when I faced that, I thought, well, all right, no big deal. Let's see if I can contribute to the plugin to add the functionalities I want. So I went to its GitHub, and that's what a Capacitor plugin looks like. First of all, we can see it's an NPM package. Capacitor plugins are distributed through NPM and are installed like any other NPM packages that you're used to. After all, that's part of why we picked Capacitor to start with. Next, we have the Android and the iOS folders. Those folders hold the native code for Android. So inside it, we have Java or Kotlin, and iOS with Swift or Objective-C. And finally, we have the SRC folder. Inside it, we have a type definition file that defines the methods our plugin exposes. So we have a start method that will start a camera in the case of the camera plugin, a capture method to take a picture, and so on. That's the TypeScript part of the plugin. Now we'll do something a bit scary, but we'll be fine, trust me. We'll peek inside the Android folder. And I won't judge, but Java developers just love to nest their code under dozens of folders. But after digging for a bit, we'll find a camera preview file. And this file is the entry point of the Capacitor plugin on the Android side. On the iOS side, we'll have a similar one, but nested under way less folder because it's not Java. So, well, picking inside this file, we'll notice that we have the same methods that were defined inside our definition file. We have the start method, capture method, and so on. And great, so from here, I think we're starting to have a pretty good idea of what a Capacitor plugin looks like. And on my end, getting back to my problem, I wanted to add new features to this plugin. So I thought maybe I could add a few methods I wanted here and there and roll with it, right? Well, looking more deeply at the Android code, I learned that it's coded using the Android hardware camera plugin, which is a library developed by Android. So I went to Android documentation to learn more about it, and that's where I discovered that Android hardware camera does not provide fine-grained control over the phone camera sensor, sadly. And that makes sense. This library was introduced alongside Android's first release back in 2008. Since then, phone cameras have gotten immensely more capable, and explains the lack of features of this first library, but that's also why people at Android introduced in 2014 Android Hardware Camera 2 as a more modern and future-proof camera library for Android. But because it's handling more complex cameras, this meant it also has an entirely different API. And this meant for me that I couldn't just use it inside the camera plugin without writing the whole code base. So it was not possible to contribute the features I wanted to the Capacitor camera plugin without rewriting everything on the Android side, which is not something I felt confident doing. At that point, I really thought I had reached a dead end. So, well, like making the camera app I wanted with Nuxt and Capacitor was not possible. So I even thought about breaking my oath and started to look at React Native. So React Native, like Capacitor, it has its own plugin ecosystem, and there are some camera plugins inside it. But so I tried them, And I quickly realized that also React Native camera plugins had the very same limitations that Capacitor camera plugins had. They were either relying on the old Android hardware camera library or offered too limited of an APIs. So that really seemed like a dead end in my journey of making a camera app with JavaScript as a whole, unless I made my own Capacitor camera plugin. So I know I've been a really good French citizen at complaining about everything, like no plugins are suited to my liking, like there's issues everywhere. So let's stop the complaint here and discuss about how to make Capacitor plugins of ours. But before, another quick question break. This time I want to ask you, do you build or use in-house packages at your company or for yourself? NPM packages or any kind of packages really? Maybe you have like an internal UI kit, an internal authentication library, or a collection of animation helpers that you use at your job, or maybe that you build at your job. So please grab your phone again, scan on one of those QR codes, or just follow one of those links, and this will help me frame better the next part of this talk. And once again, I'll be back to it in a few to accommodate the stream delay. So then, how do you build a Capacitor plugin? And I know this is getting a bit niche in the talk, like we won't be talking about Java development or anything. I just focus on what's important for everyone to know here. So we can get started with Capacitor plugins with this command. And after running it and answering through prompts, we'll end up with a project like that. And I don't know, but like we're already familiar with that project structures as it's the same that we saw before. Like it's still an NPM package. We still have the SRC folder and the Android and iOS folders or the native code for our plugin. So from here, we'll be able to develop our plugin. And getting back to our poll from before, well, this time we can see that like a majority of us actually use and build in-house packages that are job at our company. You may be still answering. Thank you all, everyone, for participating, by the way. And well, this is exactly what we're doing here. We're building a plugin to suit our very need when building a mobile app with Nuxt. And that's what we're doing. So that's what I did on my end. I ran the command from before, and from here, I started to work on Capacitor Camera 2, which is my Capacitor plugin for operating cameras with Android, except that it's now powered by Android hardware Camera 2. It's only for Android. The reason for that is that I'm an Android user and I don't have an iPhone to test it with. Remember, this is just a side project of mine. And also, it's written in Java. Well, it's more common these days to use Kotlin for Android development, but in my case, I worked at a bank before. We are using Java there, so I was more at ease with Java, so I went with Java. I didn't want to learn a whole new language for that. And finally, and more importantly, this plugin has a broader API for controlling the phone camera, which is what I was after to start with. So I know we're talking a lot about native things here, but hear me out. What's great about Capacitor plugins is that sure, you have to write some native code, but that native code is greatly reduced in scope thanks to Capacitor plugin. And one thing that I really want to emphasize for this talk is that not everyone in the team has to be familiar with plugin development and native code. Only a few has to be, and this allows you to still concentrate most of your effort on building the Nuxt app itself. On my end, I started to have a really capable camera plugin with manual and automatic mode. It could take pictures, generate thumbnail, and manage EXIF's data, and even add picture-in-picture support. On the Nuxt side, I was able to use it for simple, composable use camera, and everything else was a breeze. From here, I was able to complete the first version of my camera app, and I was really happy with it, so I sent it to the team in Tokyo working on the real camera prototype. And I guess they were pretty happy to see the results and experience their prototype in the form factor of a mobile app. More on that in a few. So, okay, I know we're talking about a lot of things, but one thing I want to make sure in this talk is that here, I want to acknowledge that we won't be all making camera apps here. But my story is just an example. We can make all kinds of apps with Nuxt and Capacitor. We can make mail apps, service apps, e-commerce apps, and so on. And one thing that is pretty common when making mobile apps that we want them to have a native look and feel. Indeed, designers won't use material design on iOS, and likewise, they will avoid use iOS design on Android because this feels odd. So we saw before that we have the dialog plugins that allows us to ask to open native dialog and ask users for confirmation. But what if we want our whole UI or part of it to have a native look and feel? Well, in that case, Capacitor got you covered with Ionic. Ionic is a huge library of components, but it's more than that because each component Ionic provides you with will render differently based on the platform it's running on. That means that, for example, an action sheet component will render like an action sheet, an iOS action sheet on iOS, and like an Android action sheet on Android. This is the same component. More than that, there's also a comprehensive theming API for Ionic that allows you to customize those components and also use your own brand color so everything stays on brand. So you'll think you want to use Ionic in your project. In that case, look no further because at Nuxt, we have a Nuxt module for that. It's called Nuxt Ionic. It's maintained by Daniel Rowe, and you can get started with it with just one command, as with every Nuxt module out there. You can learn more about all of that at ionic.nuxtjs.org, but no worries, I will share with you all the links later on. So, all right, that was quite a lot of things we discussed about. We talked about Capacitor, Capacitor plugins, and Ionic. So let's answer a question from the start. Can Nuxt make great mobile apps? Well, yes, absolutely. It's all made possible by Capacitor. It's a native runtime for building web native apps for Android, iOS, and more. It works by leveraging a web view to render our code, and we admitted that this is less performant than running fully native code, but that with the performances our phone have nowadays, this is more than acceptable. On the brighter side, because of that, we can benefit from everything we already know about web development to build our app. We can share code between our web app and our mobile app and have the same developer experience for building them. When we want to perform native operations from our mobile app, Capacitor plugins are connected to the native runtime of our phones through a bridge, and we can leverage that bridge through Capacitor plugins. They are comparable to Nuxt modules in a way, and there's a lot of first-party Capacitor plugins available out there, and the community also has made a lot of them. Finally, plugins are just packages, so you already know to install them and how to use them. Next, while building really specific applications like me with my camera app, there might not be already a plugin for your use case. In that case, it's not a dead end. You can write your own plugins. And doing so is great because it allows you to access any native component you can think of. All of that with a greatly reduced scope when it comes to the native code you have to write. And one thing that I want to emphasize again here is that not everyone in the team has to be familiar with plugin development and native code. Only a few people have to be. Finally, do you want your app to have the look and feel of Android and iOS? In that case, we have Ionic for you. It's a large library of customizable components that will render differently based on the platform they are running on. Using Nuxt? Well, we have Nuxt Ionic for you, and you can get started with it with just one command. So that's all for me. On my end, I'll be heading to Japan next year to meet the team behind the real camera, my camera app portrait, and maybe we'll hack a few things together. You can find everything about this talk, slides, the source code, and more at lucie.red/nextnation. Thank you so much for having me.
Yay, Lucie. Thank you. All right. We do have a few questions for you. Is Capacitor such a powerful as Flutter in terms of final app performance?
Okay. I believe Flutter is fully compiled. So in a way, you end up with maybe something that's a bit more performant in Flutter. But Flutter is still not native code, so there might be limitations with it regarding like what you can do and everything, just like I experienced myself with like interacting with the camera. Like you might have to write some like connectors to the native components of the phone. But I believe like Flutter will ultimately be faster because it's not using a web view fully to render your application. But once again, I want to emphasize it. Like I think in many cases, like the web view performances are really fine for many apps. And there's a lot of benefits to using this approach, I believe.
Thank you. Okay. How does adding multiple capacitor plugins affect the loading time of a website? Does the initialization of the plugins impact the initial load or only come into effect later in the app's lifecycle?
Okay, so I haven't digged really deeply into that, but I've used a ton of plugin on my application like that I use like for my camera app, and I didn't feel any issue with that. One thing that is to know, like when you interact with Capacitor plugins, because it has to go through this bridge to talk to the native components of your phone, everything is happening asynchronously. So I believe like it doesn't add like much like overhead to your application, like because you just call them when you need them, and it's not something that has to fully load before. And most of the Capacitor plugins are in native code anyway, as we just saw, like with Java, Kotlin, or Swift and Objective-C on the iOS side. And so this should be like as performant as any native application.
Thank you. And last question. Is there a timeline for a stable 1.0 version of Nuxt.js
Wow, so
Ionic?
that's
Wow.
an excellent question to which I don't have the answer. But one great thing is that Daniel is up on stage in 30 minutes, so I'm sure he will have the answer to that.
We'll ask
Sorry about
then. We'll ask then.
sorry. Yeah, but I'll make sure to ask Daniel anyway and to share the answer.
Oh, and we got one more question added. What about a watch app for Apple Watch? Would you code the watch part of the app in iOS? It's called Tiger. Wow, Target. It clearly says Target with native code, then similar to a plugin, communicate with the main capacitor app.
Well, you can code like Apple Watch applet, like a app with Capacitor. I believe there's even like a Capacitor plugin to do like things with the Apple Watch stuff. So like you should be able to do that in Capacitor and to even maybe have Nuxt running on your Apple Watch, which would be quite interesting. Yeah, I think that's possible.
Cool. And then also for a native mobile app, what are the advantages of using Nuxt versus Vue?
Well, like when you're using Nuxt to build your native app, mobile native app, like you bring along like everything like Nuxt provides you with. And one of the big part of that is a great developer experience and ecosystem that comes around Nuxt. So like you have all the routing, like you have the Nuxt Ionic module that we talked about. Like all of that like comes through and like gives you like a really nice developer experience. And what is really awesome with Nuxt, that Nuxt like can scale down and scale up according to your usage. Like if you just have a really simple like one-page app, like I do with my camera app, like Nuxt is able to scale down and give me the most of its performances like for a really simple app. Whereas like if you start to have like a really big app with routing and everything, Nuxt will also like scale up and provides you and empower you like for your journey of being a big mobile app with it. Whereas with Vue, you'll have like just Vue.js alone and maybe Vite. You'll have to like figure out a lot of those things for yourself and maybe make a lot of mistakes along the way. So really Nuxt is more like a safety net in a way, like because it will, more than just a framework, it will support you in your journey of building that mobile app.
Thank you. All right, Lucy, that is the end of our questions. Thank you so much for joining
Oh,
us.
thanks.